My name is David Ansara. I'm the CEO of the Free Market Foundation, which is headquartered in Johannesburg, South Africa. Our mission is very simple: to promote and to protect individual rights in South Africa and more broadly in the region. That includes private property rights, your freedom to trade goods and services, and your labor. We believe very strongly that the size and scope of government should be very limited, and also we believe that society should be based on the rule of law rather than the rule of man. If you look at all the countries that are ranked and you divide them into quartiles, what you often experience is that the poorest people in free societies are a lot better off than the poorest people in unfree societies. So there's this misconception that capitalism only benefits the rich, but in fact it is all people in a society that benefits from that. So there's this economic question of what produces the best outcomes, but there's also this philosophical question of how ought we to treat people in terms of public policy and enabling them to achieve a life that is self-directed, where people can flourish and where they can pursue their own ends and objectives. So liberty is really about human freedom and your freedom to choose. And so, when we look at something, for example, like private property rights, that's not just a cold analytical question of what produces the best outcomes in terms of development. Private property rights are a human right, and they are indivisible from your broader human rights as a person. Without private property rights, you lack other capabilities like civil and political rights. So the Free Market Foundation was founded in 1975 by a group of concerned businessmen and lawyers who were worried about the future trajectory of South Africa. And there was a need that was recognized for a radical alternative set of ideas. Radical in the sense that they were different to what was currently prevailing in South Africa at the time, but really rooted in a timeless tradition of classical liberalism, that the state should be limited, that the rule of law should govern all people, not just the people who have political power or who are part of a chosen group or preferred group. And this idea of universal rights, I think, very important. Unfortunately, in South Africa, the prevailing consensus in terms of the politics is very much statist and socialist, and we see ourselves as a bit of a fly in the ointment, asking difficult questions, creating public pressure to resist some of those policies. And unfortunately, in South Africa over the last 30 years, we've seen a lot of breakdown in basic capabilities of the state, the ability for the state to uphold law and order and the rule of law, as well as the provision of basic services, electricity, rail infrastructure, ports. All of those are under extreme stress or are actually collapsing. So a big role for the Free Market Foundation is to advocate for privatization, political decentralization, to spread power down and out to the smallest political unit, which is the individual, but also local government authorities, provinces, etc. We see ourselves as amplifying the voice for liberty in the country. So we produce a lot of content in the traditional media. We also produce a lot of video content and other social media content to disseminate the importance of individual liberty. So that's on the policy advocacy front. But then one of the projects that we're most proud of is the Khaya Lam Project. So not only do we have a philosophical attachment to this idea of private property rights, but we want to give practical expression to that commitment. So I mentioned that in South Africa, during the apartheid period, black people were denied access to private property rights. And during the transition away from apartheid, the state divested itself of the ownership of huge amounts of properties that had black families that had been living in those properties as tenants of the state for sometimes generations. And so what then happened post 1994 was that many of these families lived in these properties. They were considered the owners of these properties by the communities that they lived in, but they didn't have any legal proof of their ownership status. They didn't have that very important document, the title deed. And so the Khaya Lam Project recognized this gap and was formed in a way to formalize the ownership status of many thousands of South Africans who are in this grey zone at the moment. And this is an incredibly powerful tool. So in 2010, we ran some pilot projects. 2013, the very first title deeds were handed out. And this was a significant date because it was 100 years after the Native Land Act, which in 1913 deprived Black South Africans of their property rights. So Rising Tide have been a very important partner in the success of the Khaya Lam Project. So in 2018, with support from Rising Tide, Khaya Lam essentially between 2018 and 2020 transferred over 1,000 titles that were directly attributable to the support of the Rising Tide Foundation. So that's been a very significant contribution by Rising Tide and has really helped to give expression to this very important idea of private property rights. And there's obviously a direct benefit for the beneficiaries there in terms of economic opportunity. So these beneficiaries can now use their property as collateral to take out a loan from a financial institution to start a business perhaps. There's this very important benefit of intergenerational wealth transfer. Some of the beneficiaries of this program have been 80, 90 or even 100 years old in some cases. And you know, when it's a very moving experience when you go to these title deed handover ceremonies and you see these very elderly people, very dignified people receiving these title deeds with tears streaming down their cracked cheeks. And sometimes you will have a journalist saying, well, why are you so emotional about this? It's not, you know, you're near the end of your life. That's sort of the implication. But their answer is always, well, now I can die in peace knowing that my children will have a place, a home of their own. And that's what Khaya Lam means, my home. You know, so there's that intergenerational wealth aspect. People who've sacrificed their whole lives for the welfare of their children or their grandchildren who can now see that asset pass on even after they've left the world. So RTF has been essential not only in the provision of financial support for this project, but also in terms of programmatic expertise, institutional knowledge, and I think some of the reporting requirements that RTF has you know, really helps you to clarify what is your mission, what does success look like, and what is the tangible outcome of your work. You know, I think many organizations confuse outputs with outcomes, and it's very easy to get lost in the outputs. But what are you actually trying to achieve? What's the broader mission? And I think Rising Tide Foundation sees itself not just as an organization that gives money to worthy causes, but actually a partner in your project. We want people to buy into the idea of private property rights. As I mentioned, there are political forces that are questioning and dismissing the importance of private property rights as just something for the wealthy or the middle classes. But we want to create a bulwark against those kinds of attitudes. So there's not just the material benefit of owning your home, but there's also an ideological benefit as well. In the cultural context in many African countries, often women lack economic power, and so this is a very important instrument for equalizing your access to private property rights. So if you consider some women might be widowed and then the family of the deceased husband now tries to reclaim the property, what recourse do you have against that? Maybe women are reluctant to leave the home in search of work or economic opportunities because they fear that if they are away for long enough, say 6 months or so, if they returned, maybe somebody else has taken over ownership of the house and they can't claim it back. We've seen many countries that have released themselves from the shackles of socialism and communism, for example, in Eastern Europe or Southeast Asia or Latin America. These countries have thrived as a result. And there is still a lot of value that exists in South Africa, a lot of wealth and opportunity, but that is shrinking and that is diminishing. So we want to be part of arresting that decline, but also providing a positive alternative vision for the future. And I think particularly in times of crisis, that also represents an opportunity. Well, free markets are essentially a free lunch. Both parties benefit, right? So if you go to the store and you buy a sandwich, who's benefiting there, the consumer or the seller? Well, there's mutual benefit, it's not a zero sum. And so we want to take that principle and expand it. I think there's this misconception that free markets only benefit the wealthy or people who already hold assets, but actually free markets fundamentally are very disruptive. Often you see the status quo being upended by new innovations or new ways of thinking. So free markets is really about unlocking human potential. It's about voluntary exchange as well. It's the absence of coercion. And when you use state-backed power to enforce regulations, you have to ask, well, who's benefiting from that? Which constituency is that in service of? And often people implore the government to do something. But I often say to people, well, replace the word government with the politicians you know operating on a 5-year election cycle. And politicians obviously have their own interests and their own agendas. So we want to reduce state power and maximize human agency and flourishing.